Thank you very much, Claire, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd just like to add my own welcome to you all, and it is really great to see so many people here. As the topic is on bold ambition, I think it is important that we discuss those challenges, but I think very firmly focus on the opportunities. I also would like to thank our partners and sponsors today, Air, Accenture and Merck, and really grateful for your support. This is definitely a theme that's close to my own heart. Over the last, this is the 7th in the series of the annual CEO lecture. When we started in 2010, it was the month before the Troika arrived. And at that time, we were ambitious as well. We said that the Irish economy was already adjusted at that point. 2010 was a record year for exports, exceeded anything that went during the Celtic Tiger. And there's been growth every year since on our exports. So it's record year after record year. Unfortunately, domestic demand did not respond in the same fashion. But now we're seeing that occurring, and Claire rightly points out that the economy last year in volume terms increased by 8%, but in money terms, it actually increased by 13.5% in a single year. So we see a transformation in the Irish economy in terms of the debt to GDP dynamics. And so this notion that we can't afford to be ambitious is precisely wrong. And I think that's what we need to address today. So this notion that we don't have the resources or the capacity to achieve our ambition, we need to set that aside right from the start. And so business is investing in this economy. The big driver last year wasn't exports. Exports was a driver during the early part. It was domestic demand drove the Irish economy. And that's consumers are now starting to spend, but fundamentally it's been investment from firms in machinery and equipment, building and construction has been the main driver. So we're already well underway. The question is now, what do we do with that bold ambition, and how do we tap in to the very significant private savings that are in the economy? And that's why we're encouraging the government, the nascent government, to have an ambition and to share that ambition, and also to address some of the inaccuracies around where the economy is at. At the time, 7 years ago, many were skeptical, perhaps understandably, about our ambition. But it is inexplicable, despite the overwhelming evidence that exists now, that people are mixing up recovery with perhaps what they really want to describe as restoration to where they ultimately were. But with that type of momentum in the economy, we're going to get there and get there fast. The question is, do we waste the opportunity, or do we actually build a sustainable Ireland? And that is a great opportunity as we're going through this decade of centenaries to find ourselves in that place. Current demographic trends, I think, are important. In less than 50 years, we will see the island of Ireland reach 10 million people. First time in its history. And Ireland, as we know, is unique globally in having a lower population today than in the 1840s. There are 6.5 million of us on the island. The census this weekend may surprise us. We may even reach 5 million in the south, which will explain a lot of the pressures that are on our system, which are never acknowledged. Our population is increasing. Dublin increased by 2.5% in a single year, explaining some of the pressures that are coming onto our infrastructure, but also into our A&Es. Again, something that very rarely gets talked about. And Ireland as a hub for globalization has huge opportunities, but also our indigenous multinational companies have had dramatic surges over the last decade. And again, very little expression is given to those success stories. But once they're told, they're incredibly inspiring to people. Again, going back to 7 years ago, a little video we did at that point called Ireland by the Numbers went viral and became a really sensation, not just in the business community, but also in the educational system with children and so on, to show the different types of futures that were out there and the fact that some incredible things are already happening in Ireland. So with that kind of population dynamic, that gives us the ambition for an Ireland to grow at 4% per annum without end. Because when you're coming from a low base in population and the type of business model here, that type of ambition doesn't need to be put in a 5-year or 10-year window. We can build for a bigger Ireland ad infinity, because we have a long way to go. 10 million is not ambitious in historical context. In the 1840s, the island of Britain was 17 million people. Today it's 65 and increasing. So if we were pro-rated, there'd be 32 million on the island. So 10 is quite a modest ambition, but one that we're very fast approaching and need to plan for. Of course, we need a government to actually steer us in that, and not one that's preoccupied with fighting the last recession or even the last general election. So this incoming government needs to have an unwavering focus on the significant challenges we face, but also to do it with ambition. So one mandate that we really need to get over to the incoming government is to raise up from some of the squabbles, which are really just deck chairs, be it about Irish water or the structure, but to actually focus in on the fact that the economy in which we live in grew by 20 billion euros last year. To put in context some of the sterile debate about fiscal space. The fiscal space is completely bounded by an idea that everything has to come from public expenditure. And yet we live in a society that has huge private savings with no mechanism in which to tap into those savings to provide the necessary and critical infrastructure that we talked about. One of the visuals you will see during the day is our ambition for a motorway system that would connect up the island. We have capacity, we have over 2,500 kilometres of motorway which are radial out of Dublin. To complete the orbital motorway, which will be transformational, would require about 20 billion euros. That sounds like a lot of money, but there's already 2 million of us at work. And just the servicing cost of that would require just a few euros per week to provide an infrastructure that could be transformative. Nearly 90% of the population would live within 10 kilometres getting onto that motorway system. We've seen the transformation in the business models that the radial motorways have already provided to the economy. So these are the type of things that we need ambition on. And so we need to move beyond the kind of sterile debate of who did what did austerity mean, or self-congratulatory look back that we didn't drown in that kind of first phase of triathlon. We need to get on the bike and start cycling quite quickly because others are getting out there ahead of us. So with that ambition, we need to turn to that investment. And infrastructure in all its guises, be it in broadband or motorway or ports and so on, are critical to have the confidence to expand out the economy for that increased demographic that we're hoping for. So we need a radical rethink on how we invest in infrastructure, and that involves significant use of public-private partnerships, given that the fiscal rules in Europe are not fit for purpose, particularly fit for purpose for an economy that's experiencing an increasing population. And yet Europe acknowledges that critical investment and private savings should form part of it, because that's the whole rationale of the Juncker plan. And yet we're still in a very sterile view of, in Ireland, about what can and cannot be put onto the public debt position. The Irish government debt to GDP ratio peaked at over 120% in just 2013. Just 3 years ago, lots of commentators were said this debt burden we would not be able to escape from. Since then, it's been on a steady downward path. It is now at 94% in 3 years. It is jumping by 10 percentage points a year. We predict in 2017, the gross debt will be down to 80%. And we take account of the cash balances in the National Treasury, the assets that are built up already in the banking shares. The debt to GDP ratio is fast becoming one of the best in Europe, from having been perceived as one of the worst and crippling for the Irish economy. That story is over. Time to stop talking about this debt burden and time to move on to say, what do we do with the resources that we have? And they are significant, but there are many competing claims on those resources. And what we need is an ambition and a vision to actually put the resources we have and the talents we have here to make Ireland not just where it is today as a prosperous member state and one of the most prosperous member states in the European Union, but to now make it one of the biggest and richest regions of the European Union. Ireland is ranked about 30th in the 235 regions of the European Union. Our ambition should be to get into the top 10, and something that Ibec has been pushing over the last 7 years. Again, we're looking at the financing of our debt has never been at a lower level. We see that the NTMA, again, are able to get away bond finances at extraordinary low rates, and yet we sit passively without putting in that infrastructure build against a once in a lifetime opportunity to connect into what is basically free financing money to provide infrastructure that will have a rate of return that could easily be ahead of a cost of capital of 4 times the current rate. Again, this is paucity of ambition. Of course, we need to invest wisely, but again, economic activity is gravitating towards Dublin, as Jerry pointed out. At 40% of GDP in the Greater Dublin region, this is off the chart by any comparable measure. London is such a significant part of the UK, just over 20%, but modern European capitals at best are in the order of 10 to 15% of their nation's activity. So we need to dissipate that energy for the benefit of Dublin, not just for the benefit of the regions. And therefore, that is why we've been really emphasizing what might seem as old technology, a motorway system. But it is one of the legacies of being slow to modernity in not having that connectivity. So it's pretty stunning to us in the run-up to the general election that our 2 major cities after Dublin, Cork and Limerick, didn't even have an ambition to build a motorway between those 2 points. And again, I think that probably captures that really serious lack of ambition and the capacity not to be able to read the economy and to see what's going on in the economy, in the private sector. The government in Ireland constitutes 15% of the economy. On any measure you look at. Employment, 2 million people, there are less than 300,000 public sector workers. You look at the government's contribution to the 200 billion plus GDP we have here, it's 25 billion. So the government is significant and important, but it's only part of the story. And so 85% of the story lies elsewhere, as represented by people in this room. And we know that if you're not ambitious for your business, then you're going backwards. And the good news is that people here have those ambitions and people are trading successfully, particularly those who face international markets. And thankfully, the domestic-facing businesses, which have really suffered, not because of the lack of money in households, but the lack of a willingness to spend, are now beginning to see that finally unravel into more significant growth. If you want to get one statistic that is remarkable about the Irish economy, with an increasing population and a young population in household formation age groups, we still have the case where the mortgage debt is getting paid back faster than new mortgages are being taken out. That's symptomatic of an economy that actually is broken in terms of the transmission mechanisms available to domestic actors. This seriously needs to be turned around. The fact that we have an unemployment rate that has improved dramatically from 15% to 8.5% still remains too high, and unnecessarily too high, given the amount of infrastructure and investment around housing in particular that should already be up and running, if people read the economy 2 years ago, as we've continuously pointed out. So this is not speculative. The evidence is there all around us. The lack of an ambition has been manifest, and again, we have another opportunity now with an incoming government as business leaders to force that issue, not just for business, but for society, and for the real ambition for Irish people is to give the opportunity for people to stay here and contribute to this society, and to reverse the migration, forced migration that we experienced in recent years. We will always have migration. That is the nature of living on an island with a globalized outlook. But what we want is the opportunities for people to come back. And housing is by far now the most serious constraint on our ambition for growth. So it's good to see it getting the emphasis, but one will still need to see what the programme of government has in mind. On the labour market, we have to manage the more immediate pressures of recovery. The more immediate pressures are already beginning to build up in unrealistic wage expectations. This is a right that people have an ambition for restoration of pay. I think that is something that is good for business, it's good for society, it's good for normalisation. The main issue is the speed at which we get back into pay mode. For instance, the combination of pay rises and budget tax cuts have increased the average worker's take-home income by 3% in January of this year, just before they went to vote. The reality is, on average, it was a 3% increase. And in fact, if you look back to 2014, just 2 years, the average worker is better off by almost 1 month's pay, nearly 8%. And that's not us making up those numbers. They're the numbers in the CSO. They're the numbers that are reflected in the tax returns. And yet, inexplicably, we allow this narrative to develop that there is no recovery in the economy and that some people somewhere aren't feeling it. We've had to break this cycle of keeping down with the Joneses, knowing somebody somewhere who's suffering, and therefore people don't spend or don't have ambition. This is just capturing us in a trap of the paradox of thrift, and something we need to break out of very significantly. Business has done that, but we need now as society to actually get into the same mindset for the better of us all. And all of this takes place against historically low inflation. Cost of goods and services across the economy are similar to what they were in 2008. Nearly a whole decade ago, the price level has not moved. Individual items in those baskets have moved, but overall the price level is only back at 2008 levels. Not all companies are recovering or growing at the same rate. That has to be acknowledged. And some parts of the country have yet to feel the full benefit, the full restoration of the recovery. And particularly the retail businesses in particular are still 15% below where they were in 2007. So this reality will have to be reflected in wage expectations, that individual companies have a part to play in managing those expectations at the enterprise level. But Ibec is here to help you as members to negotiate that and to give you what is the norms that are out there and what can be the expectations. One of the biggest mistakes clearly from the boom years was the awarding of significant pay rises that did not accurately reflect the underlying health of individual businesses, more across the economy as a whole. So that economic crash did involve painful adjustment. Many faced having their wages frozen or cut significantly. Many others lost their jobs. So it's vital that we don't repeat those past mistakes. And so some of the current debate around wages is rather ominous. The repeated proposition that wages should be increased to make property more affordable suggests one of the most critical and obvious lessons of the crash has not been learned. It's true that a minority of workers are under significant financial pressure and trying to get onto the property ladder, but others have to contend with rising rents, higher property rights in key urban areas in particular. But that is not a sound reason for economy-wide pay increases detached from economic reality. The more major and immediate pressures on new housing need to be dealt with on the supply side rather than pumping up on the demand. Unfortunately, it now looks like we're back and moving into a period of greater industrial unrest and discord, having experienced a near decade of relative calm. But in many cases, the pay claims that are out there now go beyond what is reasonable or affordable or actually sustainable. The Lewis dispute is a good case in point, but it's just one example of ongoing and exaggerated pay claims that we're observing right across the economy. So there can be no return to that bubble economy wage inflation or spiraling relative pay claims. And so there is still no desire in the economy for centralized wage bargaining. Enterprise level bargaining is the way to go. And in fact, when we look at the industrial disagreements, they're not just restricted to the private sector. A number of public sector unions are now calling for the Lansdowne Road Agreement to be renegotiated, even though it still has 2 years to run. And under that agreement, there's around 900 million euros already earmarked for allocation to pay. So it provides the increases that are comparable to the private sector. It's a question of timing to ensure that it is sustainable. So the pay rates are already built into the Lansdowne Agreement. It's an issue of when they're to be delivered. Of course, pay must rise over time, and public sector paying conditions should be comparable to their private sector comparators on a full cost basis, including the pensions issue. But it has to happen at a sustainable rate. So we have great opportunity that the unemployment rate will come down again this year, but we have to ensure that costs do not spiral out of control or do we lose our competitive edge. So there is a responsibility on all of us to ensure that we have a system where we share in those benefits, but we need a compact in our society where we connect wages, tax cuts, pensions, social welfare payments, and industrial peace together. This is not a call for social partnership, but it's a call for realism around norm setting. In the absence of leaders setting the norms, they will be decided elsewhere, devoid of reality and given us a spark. Finally, I think it would be remiss of me not to mention the very real threats in the international context. Threats will no doubt feature in the conversation this morning. In the coming weeks, it's likely to focus the minds on the risks rather than the opportunities. The vote on the 23rd of June by the UK to leave the European Union would be a massive leap into the unknown for Britain, but also for Ireland. It would be overwhelmingly negative in the short term for Ireland, Britain and Europe itself. And again, as the IMF have recently pointed out, the economic fallout would be felt globally. So a UK departure would be a blow to Irish recovery, and it would result in a protracted period of uncertainty for business. It would undermine Europe's ability to act collectively and decisively in the world, and would push the EU back into a dangerous period of uncertainty, crisis management, and again, backward-looking policies. Ireland and the UK are close allies in Europe across a range of issues. The UK's EU membership is a key strategic importance to Ireland, to Irish business. An EU without the UK wouldn't be a much lesser union. And this is a message we intend to actively communicate over the coming weeks, here and in Britain, and more widely. A vote to leave would demand an immediate and considered and sophisticated response to minimise the damage to stability and to ensure that Irish interests are safeguarded in any subsequent negotiation and settlement. Hopefully the scenario will not arise, but as you can see on your tables today, Ibec is preparing what are the issues around Brexit for members. And we'll be very closely watching that and working with our colleagues in the CBI in the UK to get the business voice out there, which is always critical. We should never shy away of the role we play in society. So, thank you for coming this morning. There are many uncertainties, but I hope that they should be seen in the context of the incredible opportunities that are available for Irish people, for Irish business, society more generally. And we can play a part in Europe as well to give expression that Europe has worked dramatically for a small, poor economy on the western seaboard. We were transformed within 2 generations to be a modern, progressive and rich society. So we have a huge stake, not just in the European dimension, but in the all-island dimension. And that all-island dimension is something that we are very, very passionate about. And first, let's give an expression to that in terms of a motorway system that connects up this island and gives prosperity to all. Thank you.